The New York City air was thick with the usual rush-hour chaos-honking taxis, distant sirens, and the murmur of pedestrians navigating the crowded streets. Inside a small cafe near Fifth Avenue, Barron Trump grabbed his coffee, adjusting his watch. His flight to Washington, D.C. was in just a few hours, and he didn't have time for delays. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, his security detail moved swiftly, ensuring the area was clear. That's when Barron noticed something odd. A uniformed NYPD officer stood just a few feet away, leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Barron. His badge gleamed in the late afternoon sun, but his expression wasn't neutral. It carried a hint of smug amusement. The officer muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to be heard, but not clear enough to be understood. Barron paused, turning toward him. "Excuse me, sir. Were you talking to me?" The cop chuckled, shaking his head with an exaggerated smirk. "Nah, just thinking out loud." Funny how some folks always in a rush like the world owes them something. Barron raised an eyebrow but decided to let it go. Not worth it. He turned toward the black SUV where his driver and security detail were already waiting. Moments later, as the vehicle pulled onto the busy Manhattan street, the convoy moved smoothly through traffic. The driver, a former Secret Service agent, kept a steady pace, but Barron noticed they were going just a little over the limit, maybe 5 kilometers per hour too fast. Nothing major. And then blue and red lights filled the rearview mirror. A police cruiser surged forward, overtaking them, its roof lights flashing. The glowing message on the back lit up. "Pull over." Barron's stomach tightened. He knew exactly who it was. The SUV rolled to a stop at the side of the busy Manhattan street. Pedestrians slowed down, curious about what was happening. The NYPD officer, the same one from earlier, stepped out of his patrol car with deliberate slowness, adjusting his belt. His name tag read Officer Gaines, and his face carried the same smug expression as before. He walked up to the driver's side window, tapping the glass with 2 fingers. The security driver lowered it smoothly. "License and registration," Gaines said flatly. His voice wasn't aggressive yet, just loaded. The driver handed over the documents without a word. Gaines barely glanced at them before stepping back, taking a long, exaggerated look at the SUV, then at Barron in the back seat. "Step out of the vehicle." A flicker of tension moved through the air. The security agent in the passenger seat subtly shifted his posture, ready for anything. Barron took a breath, then opened the door and stepped out, standing tall. He was already a full head taller than the officer, and that clearly didn't sit well with Gaines. The cop let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Man, I swear, life just hands some folks everything on a silver platter." Barron kept his expression neutral. "Was there a reason you pulled us over, officer?" Gaines smirked. "Oh, I dunno. Maybe 'cause your driver thinks speed limits don't apply to rich folks." He paused, tilting his head. "Or maybe I just wanted to see how royalty reacts to being treated like a regular citizen." A few people in the crowd murmured in interest, while others scoffed. Some were already taking out their phones, sensing that something was about to go down. Barron folded his arms. "So this isn't about the speed limit, it's about my name?" Gaines' smirk widened slightly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he circled Barron slowly, like he was assessing him. Then, casually, he threw in the first real jab. "You ever wonder what it's like, Trump? Not being born into privilege? Not having a whole security team wiping your nose for you?" Barron exhaled slowly. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. "Officer, are you conducting a traffic stop or an interrogation?" The crowd let out a few chuckles Gaines noticed. His jaw tensed, and his eyes narrowed slightly. It was just getting started. The street noise seemed to fade into the background as Officer Gaines stood face to face with Barron Trump, his posture dripping with barely concealed hostility. The occasional flash of a phone camera from the gathered crowd added to the tension. turning what should have been a routine traffic stop into a public spectacle. Barron remained calm, hands resting at his sides, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this kind of baiting before. Gaines, however, wasn't done. He took a slow step forward, letting his voice carry just enough to be heard by the onlookers. "You know, I was thinking." He made a show of tapping his chin. "What kind of example would it set if I just let you drive off without consequences?" Barron frowned. "Consequences for what?" "You still haven't told me if we even broke a law." Gaines chuckled, a humorless sound, then leaned in slightly, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "See, that's the thing about privilege. You don't even recognize it when it's staring you in the face." A few people in the crowd nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. "I know how this works, Trump," Gaines continued, pacing slightly. "People like you, your family. You think you own this country. That you make the rules while the rest of us have to follow them. Must be nice, huh?" Barron's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react, not yet. Gaines scoffed, shaking his head. "You know what really gets me?" He turned toward the crowd, as if inviting them into the conversation. "Your daddy built his whole brand on acting like he cares about America. But tell me, Trump Jr., what's he ever done for people who actually look like me?" The crowd stirred at that, some murmuring in agreement. A few voices called out, "Yeah, answer that. He only cares about rich white people." Barron exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. He wasn't going to let this guy control the narrative. "You mean aside from creating millions of jobs, investing in historically black colleges, and passing criminal justice reform?" Barron's voice was cool, level. "Or are we just ignoring that part?" Gaines' smirk twitched, just for a second. He hadn't expected Barron to fire back so quickly. "Oh, so now you're an expert in race relations?" Gaines shot back. "Tell me something, Trump. When was the last time you had to worry about getting pulled over because of the color of your skin?" Barron didn't blink. "When was the last time you had to worry about being targeted just because of your last name?" The crowd reacted immediately, a mix of shocked gasps, murmurs, and a few approving nods. Gaines huffed a laugh, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes' irritation. He wasn't in control of the conversation anymore, and he hated that. Officer Gaines folded his arms, his smirk turning sharper, as if he'd found the perfect opening. "Targeted because of your last name?" he repeated mockingly. "That's cute. But let's be real. Trump, your family ain't exactly known for being victims." The crowd reacted, some laughed, others nodded, but a few faces remained skeptical, watching Barron carefully. Gaines took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you know who are real victims? The people your father and his MAGA cult have been screwing over for years." Barron's expression remained unreadable, but inside, he felt the familiar frustration rise. "Here it comes." Gaines continued, his words deliberate, cutting. "All that "Make America Great Again" talk? We both know what that really means. It's a dog whistle. A nice little slogan for people who want to go back to the good old days when guys like me knew their place. A few in the crowd cheered at that. Others looked uncomfortable. Some whispered among themselves. Barron let a brief silence linger before speaking. "You mean the good old days when my father was signing bills to help black businesses grow? Or when he funded HBCS at record levels? Or—" Gaines snorted loudly, cutting him off. "Oh, please. Your daddy throwing a few dollars at black colleges isn't erased decades of discrimination." Barron tilted his head slightly, his voice still calm. "That's interesting. So if a conservative helps minorities, it's just a PR stunt. But when a liberal does it, it's progress." A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement, while others remained defiant. Gaines rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of irritation. Barron wasn't taking the bait. "Look, man," the officer said, "this ain't just about your dad. It's about all of you. Conservatives, Republicans, the whole lot of you. always crying about values and tradition. But tell me something, when's the last time your people actually cared about anyone that doesn't look like you? That got some applause from the liberal onlookers. Barron took another breath. It would be so easy to snap back. But he wouldn't give Gaines that satisfaction. Instead, he spoke clearly, deliberately. Caring about someone doesn't mean agreeing with them on everything. My family, my party, and I believe in equal opportunity. You believe in equal outcome. That's a big difference. The officer's smirk faltered for just a second. Barron continued, "You call my father divisive, but I've seen more division come from people like you, who see everything through the lens of race, of class, of identity. You don't want unity, you want control." That hit. The crowd was now split, some nodding at Barron's words, others shaking their heads in frustration. Gaines' jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, so now you're the voice of unity?" He sneered, "Spare me. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. Everything's been handed to you." Barron just exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe instead of assuming, you should ask." The tension in the air was thick, and Gaines was losing control of the narrative. Officer Gaines exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. He had expected Barron to get flustered, maybe lose his temper, but instead, the young Trump stood his ground, calm and collected, and that infuriated him. "Oh, so now I'm supposed to believe the Trump family is a bunch of saints?" Gaines scoffed, shaking his head. "Give me a break." Barron simply tilted his head, waiting. Gaines glanced at the crowd, playing to his audience. "Tell me something, Barron. Your dad's whole fan base, you really expect me to believe they care about guys like me?" He tapped his own chest, emphasizing his black identity. "You expect me to believe they don't secretly wish America was just a little whiter?" A murmur spread through the onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. It was a bold accusation. Barron let a second of silence stretch. Then, in a steady voice, "I don't expect you to believe anything, officer. But I will say this, if my father and his supporters were really the raging racists you claim, why did he get more minority votes in 2020 than any Republican in decades?" That landed hard. Gaines' nostrils flared slightly, but Barron didn't stop. "You want to paint this picture of conservatives as the enemy because it's easier than admitting the truth. People don't buy into your victim narrative anymore." The crowd stirred. Some people nodded slowly. Others shook their heads, unwilling to accept the shift in momentum. Gaines scoffed, shaking his head. "All right, so now I'm just imagining discrimination? You don't think people like me get treated differently in this country?" Barron's voice remained level. "Everyone faces struggles, officer. Yours are not unique." Gaines froze. Barron took a step closer. "You think I don't face judgment because of my last name? Because of who my father is? You think people don't make assumptions about me before I even say a word?" A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement. Gaines opened his mouth to fire back, but Barron didn't let him. "You talk about privilege, but you know what real privilege is. Being able to claim victimhood anytime something doesn't go your way. You hide behind your badge, behind your race, behind your ideology, because it's easier than taking accountability." The crowd reacted immediately. Some clapped, some booed. Some just stood there, stunned. Gaines' face twisted with frustration. He had lost control of the conversation. A wave of tension settled over the crowd. Officer Gaines shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. He had spent years dealing with smug Wall Street types, entitled politicians, and privileged brats who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. Barron Trump wasn't folding. Gaines rolled his shoulders back, speaking louder now, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Listen, kid. You can throw out all the stats you want, but you know what I see? A rich, sheltered conservative who's never had to fight for a damn thing in his life." Barron's expression remained unreadable, but inside, he could feel the old frustration creeping up. The same frustration his father had talked about. The constant attacks, the assumptions, the twisting of reality to fit a broken narrative. But he wouldn't let Gaines dictate the terms of this argument. Fight? Barron's voice was steady. You think I haven't had to fight for anything? Try being a Trump in America today. Try walking into any university, any newsroom, any social space without people assuming you're the villain before you even say a word. A few people in the crowd nodded. Even some of the liberals hesitated. Gaines huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Oh, please. You're trying to compare being a Trump to being a minority in America? That's gotta be the dumbest thing I've heard all day. Barron took a step forward, not aggressively, just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. I'm not comparing struggles, officer. I'm saying everyone has battles. You refuse to see mine because it doesn't fit your narrative. Gaines snorted. Oh, so now you're a victim? Give me a break. Barron's eyes locked onto Gaines, his voice calm but cutting. No, officer, I'm just not interested in playing one. The crowd reacted immediately. Some clapped, some muttered. Others just stood in stunned silence. Gaines exhaled sharply, looking to the crowd, trying to find support. But even some of the people who had cheered him earlier were now uncertain. The dynamics were shifting, and he could feel it. For the first time in the exchange, he looked unsure. Barron folded his arms, waiting, and Gaines was running out of ammo. A thin layer of sweat had formed on Officer Gaines' forehead. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. He had expected this to be easy, a simple show of dominance over some privileged conservative kid. But Barron wasn't breaking. And the crowd? They were listening. Gaines gritted his teeth, then went for the lowest blow possible. You want to talk about narratives, Trump? Fine. Here's one. He jabbed a finger at Barron's chest. Your father, your whole damn family, has spent years poisoning this country, spreading hate, dividing people. And you want to stand here and pretend to be some kind of victim? The crowd reacted instantly. Some cheered in agreement, others booed loudly. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Barron exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady, controlled. My family isn't perfect. But we didn't divide this country. You did. Gaines let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Oh, so now it's my fault? The fault of every hard-working minority in this country. Spare me. Barron tilted his head slightly, studying Gaines. You know what's funny, officer? You talk about hate, but all I hear from you is resentment. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some of the onlookers who had been on Gaines' side were now uncertain. Barron took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make every word hit harder. Tell me something. What exactly do you stand for? Because from where I'm standing, all you've done is tear others down. You're not fighting for justice, you're fighting for control. And deep down, you know it. Gaines opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because Barron was right. The officer's jaw clenched, his fists tightened, and for the first time that night, he looked trapped. He had lost. Just as Officer Gaines' jaw tightened, his fists still clenched at his sides, the distant wail of sirens cut through the tension. Heads turned. The crowd parted slightly as two additional NYPD patrol cars pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing. Gaines looked up sharply, his confidence flickering for the first time. Barron stayed perfectly still. A sergeant stepped out, a stocky man in his 50s, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He surveyed the scene, then locked eyes with Gaines. Officer Gaines, the sergeant said, his voice firm. What's going on here? Before Gaines could answer, a middle-aged man in the crowd, a well-dressed conservative-looking type, stepped forward, shaking his head. What's going on? He repeated, his voice laced with disgust. We just watched this officer harass a citizen for no reason. A murmur spread through the crowd. A woman spoke up next. It was disgusting. He pulled him over for nothing, then started attacking him over his family. Gaines spun toward the crowd, his face twisting with frustration. Oh, come on. You people always play the victim until it's someone on your side being called out. The sergeant's eyes narrowed sharply. That true, Gaines? Gaines' mouth opened, then shut. Barron, meanwhile, remained composed, watching the scene unfold. Finally, he spoke. Officer Gaines seems to have forgotten that a badge is supposed to represent justice, not personal grudges. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. The sergeant exhaled slowly, then turned back to his officer. We'll talk later. You're dismissed for now. Gaines gritted his teeth. His whole body was tense, but he knew he had no move left. Without another word, he stormed toward his patrol car, yanking open the door and slamming it shut behind him. The sergeant turned back to Barron. Apologies for the trouble, Mr. Trump. You're free to go. Barron nodded politely. I appreciate that, officer. As he turned to leave, a few onlookers clapped quietly. Others whispered amongst themselves. Some still refused to accept what they had seen, but many had just witnessed something they couldn't ignore. Because tonight, Barron Trump had done what few ever could. He had taken on the system and won. As Barron stepped back into his car, he remained calm and composed. He didn't need to gloat, didn't need to argue any further. The truth had spoken for itself. The crowd had seen what happened. Some would deny it, some would twist it, but the facts remained. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about power, accountability, and the battle between truth and narrative. And tonight, truth won. As the car pulled away, Barron looked out the window, watching the officer still standing there, face tense, hands on his hips. The moment had exposed something deeper than just one man's bias. It had shown what happens when ideology overshadows justice. If you stand for truth, hit the like button. If you believe in justice, subscribe for more. And if you have something to say, leave a comment below. Let your voice be heard.